turn the talk over to you today, but we want to thank you for taking the time and joining us on our History for Lunch. Oh, and before you get started, Dr. Bowman,
Yes.
sorry about that. If our visitors today, if you have any questions for Dr. Bowman, if you'll go down to the bottom of your screen, and if you will type in your question under Q&A at the end of the talk, we will respond. I will read the questions and I'll allow Dr. Bowman to respond to the questions that you have. So Dr. Bowman, yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I said, I always love doing this. I enjoy presenting at the museum. I prefer to be actually at the museum, actually talking to people who are there and enjoying it. But unfortunately, the pandemic going around right now, and we can unfortunately, and I'm hoping next time I do this, I actually will be back in the auditorium and back seeing people and meeting people and shaking hands with people and seeing people enjoying their lunch. Thank you, Lori. I said, I remember Lori back when she was a student of mine, back when she was Lori Fitchett. And so we're very proud of the work you've done, and we're very proud how you got your education at ECSU and now work at the museum and giving back to students in the community. So we're very happy to have you at the museum. Okay, now I think we all know that 2020 is going to be one of those years that we're never going to forget. We're maybe going to want to forget 2020 for many reasons, but it's going to be one of those years that we'll probably be able to forget. This will be one of the years that kind of shape our lives. In many ways, 1960 was very similar. 1960 was a major year. It wasn't just because we had a very competitive presidential election. In 1960, it was Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's former vice president, against John F. Kennedy, and that was a contested election that was nip and tuck all the way. But it was also an important year in that what many regard as kind of the first major sit-in movement began in the United States. African Americans using a form of nonviolent protest, using the sit-in as a way to enact political, economic, social, racial change. The first sit-ins actually were before 1960. I mean, there were students at Howard University who protested using the sit-in as early as the 1940s. We know of Howard University students in Washington, D.C., who protested in the 1920s against segregated dining facilities in Congress. So 1960 wasn't the first, but we do know that on February 1st, 1960, a group of 4 students, 4 young men from what we now refer to as North Carolina A&T State University, entered a Woolworths establishment. Woolworths, as we all know, you don't see Woolworths anymore because that company went out of business. But it was once a major retailer. On February 1st, these 4 young men went to the and sat down and expected service. They didn't do anything that was other than that. They didn't, I mean, these were simply just a matter of sitting down and asking, kind of expecting service. Today, we would consider that to be a pretty straightforward adversarial act. You go to a restaurant, you sit down, and you expect service. But in 1960, that was seen as an affront to established procedures. It was in many places against laws that prohibited certain kind of actions like that. So what they did is on February 1st, 1960, you could say the sit-in, and soon after that, in a matter of days, it spread elsewhere, to Raleigh, Winston-Salem, to Charlotte, Durham, and by February the 9th, the act had gotten the attention of the Elizabeth City Daily Advance. The Daily Advance was, as it is now, the only town, and they wrote an editorial entitled "Should Stop Foolishness." Obviously, you could tell what the tone of that was. These students should just listen to what they're told. They should obey the regulations. They should obey proper customs, and they should stop expecting service at a lunch counter in a restaurant. Well, within 2 days, the sit-in movement spread to Elizabeth City. On February 11, 1960, the first sit-ins took Elizabeth City at a retailer that was once a national name. Like Woolworth is no longer in business, but on February 11, 1960, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, around 13 Elizabeth City State teachers, college students entered W.T. Grant, which was located on East Main Street, and simply went into business and sat down at the lunch counter expecting service. Now, W.T. Grant had been in town as a business. This was a national chain, by the way, since around 1921. In 1921, W.T. Grant, which was based in New York City, established a retailer in Elizabeth City. And it had become, over time, a dominant retailer. By the 1940s, that business was employing African Americans, which was unusual for the time. Very rarely did you see African Americans employed in businesses on Main Street, downtown Elizabeth City. Simply enough, that part of town was cut off in general to African Americans and to work. And what happened is in 1953, the W.T. Grant expanded and built a brand new store at 303 East Main Street. Now, if you go there today, if you go to 303 East Main Street today, you'll see something completely different. W.T. Grant's business ultimately moved. That building was torn down, and what you see now is a bunch of offices. I think there is a law firm in there. My dentist used to be in that building. It's actually right next to the old library. If you look at 303 East Main Street, it's completely different. But in 1953, 303 East Main Street was the retail capital of Elizabeth City. There was really no retail major business establishment on Erin House. Of course, there was no Walmart on Halsted Boulevard Extended. We know that. There was nothing like that. That was all empty space. That was all farmland. But my point here is that in 1953, when W.T. Grant actually built this new establishment, this became the retail establishment. So on February 11, when these 13 students or so went down to sit in, they were making a statement in what was arguably one of the most important businesses in town. Now, what happened? They sat down peacefully, and from what we can learn from the accounts that were written down, they did nothing other than simply just quietly sit there, study for their exams, read books, made almost no noise. And they did not receive any service. They were simply ignored. Now, this is started about 1 o'clock. In time, word got out around town that, hey, these students, these black students from that black college were sitting down at W.T. Grant. I mean, it's coming here. By late afternoon, the group became a lot larger. And then after P.W. Moore High School let out for the day, apparently some of those students came to W.T. Grant. And then they were involved. And so 13 became about 50. So, and when we know that at that time, W.T. Grant's manager was actually homesick with the flu. So the assistant manager was in charge. So this assistant manager is trying to just hold the fort until the manager is better and can come back to work. And of course, you can imagine her stress, like, oh my goodness, these people are in the store and they're breaking these customs and they're sitting in these doors in the dining room. So she called him and he came into work sick. And then of course the police were involved in it. Now, what did the police do? Well, the police chief at the time, a man named William Clarence Owens Sr. Many of us remember his son, Bill Owens, local real estate magnate of sorts, formerly serving in the North Carolina General Assembly in the House. And but Chief Owens actually overreact. He did not arrest those sitting down. He simply just, from what we know, brought in a few police officers to just keep an eye on things. We do know that there were also some private detectives that were plainclothes that actually were there to make certain nothing happened, to make certain there was no violence, to make certain nobody got stabbed. And you might say, really? Would somebody get stabbed by sitting at a lunch counter? Well, we do know that in South Carolina, a Benedict College student, a theology student, was actually stabbed in the back around Columbia, South Carolina. So these could have been violent. And the reality is that these students, in many ways, were putting their own health at risk by choosing just to sit down at a lunch counter. Well, anyway, the manager came in, he was sick with the flu, and he decided that, you know what, we're going to close early. So usually they close at 5:30. Back in those days, stores didn't usually stay open after 5:30 anywhere. The whole idea of a 24-hour retail establishment open like Walmart, that wasn't even conceived at that point. Remember, 7-Eleven was a big deal because they closed at 11 o'clock at night. So, I mean, the bottom line was that 5:30 was when it closed, but Mr. Walter, the manager, just decided to panic and close early. And so that ended that for that. Well, the next morning, February 12th, the store opened up, but there were some changes. First thing, there was now a rope that surrounded the luncheonette part of the store. See, W.T. Grant was unique in that it had several different businesses under the same roof. Okay, it was part retail store, part restaurant. Much like if you go to Walmart today, you can go to Walmart and you see there's a Subway there, and there's a place to get your hair cut and your nails done and pick up your prescriptions. Just like Walmart is many things under one roof, W.T. Grant was many things under one roof too. So the store was opened, but the restaurant part was roped off, and they actually had unscrewed the seats from the stools. Think of like a bicycle without the seat, okay? Obviously that makes a big difference. So I guess the manager thought that if you remove the seats, that would end the protests. Well, what happened was students came back. They saw that the area had been roped off. They marched in the store and basically hung out outside of the ropes. And there were more there than the day before. So if there was any doubt that, if there was any hope from the manager that by roping this off that this would end the protest, that was clearly going to be wrong. It was even more on February 12th. Apparently more students showed up. Now, what did the customers do? Did the customers harass and heckle these demonstrators? There were some who heckled them, but for the most part, from what we at least have recorded down in the primary sources, that for the most part, customers just looked and like, what's that? And then just did their business. They didn't get involved in it. They just kind of looked at it. Maybe a few said a few bad things and heckled the protesters, demonstrators, and then mostly just left. So, but outside the store, we do know that Main Street was divided. There were about 50 African Americans outside of the store, and across the street there were who were heckling the African Americans outside the store. So this was kind of a recipe for who knows what. And again, it could have gotten ugly, and it was kind of ugly. And again, we don't have any recorded video of this. All we have are the newspaper accounts. But by this point, we do know that the manager had talked to W.T. Grant's management. W.T. Grant was based in New York City. And so he was trying to get advice from corporate about what to do. We also know that the students were being sponsored by CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. And so this was clearly an issue that was far more than just sitting down at a lunch counter. This was becoming large scale. Again, the manager lost control of the situation and closed the store once again early. W.T. Grant, now faced with demonstrations in other cities, not just Elizabeth City, decided that it was going to close down all 180 of its lunch counters in the South. Now, was W.T. Grant against segregated lunch counters? Did W.T. Grant support the idea of having African Americans being free to eat in whites only lunch counters? Well, again, they were based in New York City. They weren't based in the South. We do know that in 1956, there was an earlier protest at a W.T. Grant's in Baltimore, Maryland. And that was resolved by W.T. Grant actually allowing African Americans to go to the lunch counter. So apparently W.T. Grant wasn't against desegregated lunch counters per se, but W.T. Grant wanted to make money. They were a business, and they weren't going to buck Southern traditions. They weren't going to offend their Southern customers. And so they were taking kind of a, let's wait and see. But they closed down all the lunch counters in the South. And this was kind of a wait and see approach. So now the question is, what's going to happen? If these lunch counters going to reopen? Are they going to permanently shut down the restaurants? That became a question, and that question wasn't going to be answered for several months. Now, what else do we know about these protests, these demonstrations? Were these only students involved, or were there those who were not students involved? Well, back in the early 1990s, the Virginia Pilot did a story. I think it was about the 30-year anniversary of the 1960 sit-in movement. And the Pilot interviewed Coach Robert Louis Vaughn. Now, anybody who's familiar with ECSU knows the name Bobby Vaughn. Bobby Vaughn was the architect of the modern-day athletics program at Elizabeth City State. He was an outstanding basketball coach who took a small teachers college and made it into a CIAA championship team. Some of his players ended up playing for over a decade in the NBA. Coach Vaughn was a tremendous figure, and that's why if you go to the campus, you will see a basketball game or a volleyball game played at the Robert Louis Vaughn complex. I mean, that's the name of the athletic center. The name has been there since the late 1970s. Well, Coach Vaughn actually said that in this to the Pilot in around 1990 that he actually had been there. Coach Vaughn said that he went to President Ridley. President Walter and Nathaniel Ridley was arguably one of the most, if not the most outstanding executive the school has ever known. Vaughn went to Ridley and asked him if he could march. Now, why would a faculty member ask the president if he could march? Well, we do know that at some historically Black schools, sometimes presidents were strongly encouraged to fire faculty and staff who worked with students and who joined students in protests. So Coach Vaughn, according to his account, went to President Ridley and asked him if he could march. And Ridley said, if you want to march, go ahead and march. And so Coach Vaughn apparently did. I have heard, though, from some who said that they don't remember Coach Vaughn being there. And again, how do we know? How do we know? But the reality is that Coach Vaughn did give a talk in October 2013 at the museum at the History for Lunch presentation during that month. And at that talk, Coach Vaughn did say that in 1963, when there was another round of demonstrations, that President Ridley asked him to go accompany the students to make certain nothing happened. Coach Vaughn in 1963 did not participate, but he kept an eye on things. So that suggests that President Ridley did know that Coach Vaughn would be supportive of those activities and would be somebody who he could trust to make certain that things would not get out of hand and that things would actually be safe for students. So we don't know for sure, but we do have that account from the early 1990s. So that's the evidence that we do have. We do know that that Coach Vaughn said Laird was very politically active. He ran for city council of sorts in the years to come. So he was somebody who was not shy about presenting and sharing his own opinions on things and such. So what happened after the stores shut down the lunch counters? It was a matter of waiting to see what was going to happen next. At the same time, North Carolina had a governor named Luther Hodges. Luther Hodges, as governor, was concerned for many things. First thing, he was concerned that the Synod movement began in North Carolina and had spread to other cities. Governor Hodges was a businessman who later became a politician. Hodges actually later became, I think, Secretary of Commerce under John F. Kennedy at some point. So Hodges was a very powerful figure. Hodges, from what we know, opposed these demonstrations, as you would expect. Not only that, but he wanted the presidents of state colleges and universities to tell him what they were doing to stop these student demonstrations. Now, how do we know this? Well, there was a folder in the state archives in Raleigh. If you look through the Luther Hodges papers, there's a folder there specifically about these student demonstrations. And in this folder, you see these letters that he wrote, not just to President Ridley at Elizabeth City State, but to all colleges and universities in the state. And he wanted them to tell him, what were you doing to stop these demonstrations? Now, what did President Ridley say? How do you respond to that? Well, from what we know, Ridley got the letter and did not respond right away. And then he got another letter from Hodges. Hodges said, well, I sent you a letter about a month ago to me, so I do want to know, what are you doing to stop these student protests? The way Hodges looked at it, Hodges was a businessman. Hodges was a capitalist. He believed that businesses had the right to discriminate against customers. He believed that since the owners are the ones who were running the establishments, the owners should have the right to say, I'm not serving certain customers. I'm not serving Black customers. I'm not serving any customers that I don't want to serve. And he believed that was the right of a business owner. And remember, this was during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the United States was fighting against communism and against central economic planning. And so there was this effort to protect capitalism. And many did see this as a threat. Many North Carolinians saw these student demonstrations as communistic. Even the Daily Advance reported during these protests that they apparently had heard about a communist being in town on campus. And of course, really, how do you spot a communist? So that was in the air. Now, what did President Ridley say to the governor? Well, President Ridley played it cleverly. He said that we're focusing on doing what we need to do to run the campus. But he didn't say, I'm opposing it, I'm supporting it. His answer was kind of like a non-answer. In other words, he played it well in that he was asked a question and he really kind of gave an answer, but it was not exactly precise, but it was enough of an answer to at least let it go. And I did read the letters from other presidents that are in this file. Some presidents actually said, we're standing strong against this governor and we're not going to let this happen to our campus and we're going to control these students. Ridley did not take that approach. The fact is that Ridley was, in many ways, by that point, kind of a national civil rights figure. He was not on par with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, but when newspapers would quote people on civil rights, sometimes they quoted President Ridley. Because Ridley was already an important figure, because Ridley was the first African American to earn an academic doctorate at a state that was once part of the Confederacy. Back in 1953, he earned an EDD from the University of Virginia. Recently, the University of Virginia decided to rename one of its buildings after Walter Nathaniel Ridley. So Ridley was a major figure nationally. At that point, at least somebody that newspapers outside the area would quote and would contact. So Ridley was in a tough situation. He tried to make certain that students didn't get hurt. He tried to make certain that peace was as much as possible. And he also knew that there were many retailers, many business owners downtown who donated to a scholarship fund to help out students. And when the Daily Advance asked President Ridley about his fear that these retailers may now no longer donate to this scholarship fund, he expressed some concern. The reality was in 1960, students did not have Pell Grants like we do today. They didn't have the federal financial aid that students can enjoy today. For the most part, in 1960, if a student wanted to go to school, he or she had to find a way to pay for it himself. And any kind of scholarship fund that would help out students was something that President Ridley would want to keep, most definitely. Because for the most part, at that time, and even so today, many students who came to campus came from impoverished families. Many students at the time were first-generation students whose families were tenant farmers or sharecroppers trying to eke a living out here in northeastern North Carolina. It was a tough living to be a student, and it was important to keep this scholarship. So President Ridley was in a very tough situation. He believed that the students were doing the right thing. He believed that facilities needed to be desegregated, but he also knew that it was important to keep the peace with the powers that be, which included, of course, Governor Hodges as well as others. Now, W.T. Grant continued to wait and see. By April 1960, W.T. Grant made it clear that they were waiting for Southern customs to change. They weren't going to buck Southern customs. So by that point, it looked kind of grim. By that point, one could surmise that the chances that these luncheonettes would reopen would be very slim. But by July 1960, there were some changes in the air. And W.T. Grant decided that it was going to reopen one by one its Southern lunch counters. And when it reopened them, these lunch counters would be desegregated. Now today is July 1st. Okay, so it was really literally almost about 60 years to this day, that W.T. Grant made the corporate decision to reopen and to desegregate. Now, that was a huge deal because in downtown Elizabeth City, desegregated businesses were, for the most part, non-existent. There really were no restaurants that admitted African Americans and would serve African Americans. The custom had been, and the tradition had been, and this custom was reinforced by the law sometimes, was that white people shouldn't be serving African Americans. It should be the other way around. Whites would have no problem hiring African Americans to be maids, to be domestic aids of sorts, but not the other way around. It was against tradition and in many ways the law to have a white person serve an African American. But W.T. Grant was saying that we're going to start doing this. So this was in many ways a major shift. Now, W.T. Grant also knew that this would have to be something that would be done and had to be done right. Now, in 1960, there was a group of African Americans. Many of these were leading professionals, doctors, teachers, clergymen and such, called the Elizabeth City Better Citizens League. And this league wanted to be leading the effort to make this desegregation go as smoothly as possible. And what we know what happened was the Better Citizens League partnered with Mount Lebanon AME Zion Church on Culpeper Street in Elizabeth City. Mount Lebanon is one of this area's most historic churches. And this church was definitely involved in the civil rights movement. And so the Better Citizens League partnered with the church. And the goal was to prepare people so this would go very well. Okay, they didn't want this to go poorly because if desegregation went poorly, W.T. Grant might just close them up again. And so the plan was, let's make certain that we're both working together and sorts. And so this was planned. This wasn't just done immediately. The the community had to be prepared for this major seismic shift in retail. Finally, on July 11, 1960, July 11, 1960 is the date that W.T. Grant reopened the lunch counter, and the lunch counter was open for all. Now, Elizabeth City was one of the first cities in North Carolina, one of the very first to have desegregated lunch counters. And over time, other cities joined and other cities opened up their lunch counters. Okay, so in many ways, that is in that this town was one of the first to have these desegregated lunch counters. But I want to make two points here. First thing, this did not mean that every restaurant in Elizabeth City, every hotel in Elizabeth City had to start admitting and serving African Americans. This was only a W.T. Grant thing at first. It wasn't until 1963 when you had a larger, more intense, more involved round of student demonstrations that you saw changes. And it wasn't until 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act that you saw desegregation become more of a reality. The reality is that these 1960 student demonstrations were the first in town, but they were by no means the last. And in 1963, there were more students involved. And this time there were student arrests. And this time there were students who went before the court. And this time there were students who took their cases to the North Carolina Supreme Court. Okay, so 1963 was a much more dramatic year. But 1960 is important in that this was the first time that students did this, and the first time that you saw lunch counters that were desegregated. Now, another point I want to make here before I'm done. Some wonder, was there a better way? Could these counters have been desegregated with some kind of letter writing campaign, or something that was not as confrontational as walking in and sitting down? Again, at that time, that was a major question. The way older African Americans were raised, they were raised to not do what the students did. Older African Americans, and this is sad, but it seems to be true, they were told to simply just, for the most part, accept it. They were told to tolerate it. They were told not to buck the trend. These students who were actually going and sitting down, to many older people, this was wrong. They might have believed that these counters should be desegregated, but that wasn't the way to do it. And how do we know this? Well, the same month that the students on February 11 sat down to lunch counter, a group of older African Americans went to the Elizabeth City Council. And they went there with a petition. And they went there before the city council and humbly asked the city council to hire African Americans on its police force. Now, at that point in 1960, the Elizabeth City Police Force, as was true in almost every southern town that I'm familiar with, and true for most northern towns too, had zero persons of color, zero African Americans on the police force. So that was seen by many as completely wrong. And of course, today it would be seen as outrageous. I mean, now of course, in our town, we have a police chief who's African American. We have a mayor who's African American. We have a school superintendent who's African American. We have in this city, in this area now, we have a more diverse leadership corps. And that's how it should be. I like it that way. But 1960, there was zero. And that was a major problem. Well, these older, distinguished professionals went to the city council and politely asked the city council and provided a petition as evidence of this desire and this demand. But they didn't push it. It took 3 years for the city to hire an African American on the police force. So Let's look at it in terms of time. It took 3 years for the city to hire Leander Respis to become the first African-American police officer. And if you read the accounts about Mr. Respis's time as police officer, he went through a lot. He suffered discrimination. He suffered all kinds of outrageous treatment from not the police chief of certain, but mostly from people who didn't respect him because of his color. The fact is, it took 3 years to get something done through that approach. The students got it done in what? February is 5 months. 5 months. So you wonder which was more effective. Well, in terms of the time it took to desegregate, 5 months trumps 3 years in that way. Now, what happened to W.T. Grant? Well, W.T. Grant did fine. The Daily Advance predicted that this might hurt the business, this would hurt the economy. Well, it didn't. W.T. Grant expanded later in 1963. And in 1968, W.T. Grant moved to a brand new location. And around 1968, 1969, the Southgate Mall opened up. And that shifted retail from downtown to the Airinghouse, to Airinghouse Street. Okay, so that was, and so W.T. Grant moved when the mall was there. If you ever look at well, it's not really a mall anymore. It's kind of like a strip mall. But when you look at Southgate now, you notice there's a long white building right next to Airinghouse. It's where Domino's Pizza is. It's where Payless Shoes used to be. There's an ice cream parlor there now too. That big, long white building is actually where W.T. Grant moved in around 1968, 1969. Okay, so that was W.T. Grant. Now, W.T. Grant as a corporation went bankrupt around 1975, and then it left Elizabeth City. The bankruptcy ended with a liquidation of the whole corporation. You might wonder what happened to W.T. Grant. Did Walmart kill it? No, Walmart didn't kill it. Walmart wasn't a major player yet. Kmart, did Kmart kill it? Not really. From what we know, W.T. Grant it was doing fine, but its financials were not sustainable. Sometimes businesses fail, not because of competition, but because they don't make intelligent decisions with the financial part of the business. And W.T. Grant went out of business and left Elizabeth City forever. But that doesn't mean that W.T. Grant isn't historically important, because it was the location of the first desegregated restaurant in town of sorts, the first desegregated establishment of its kind. And it was the start of a movement that culminated in 1963, when over 400 students went downtown to protest against the continued segregation of downtown Elizabeth City. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. I do have a question, so let me
Yes.
see. Were there white protesters outside W.T. Grant's store during the first days it started integrating?
We don't know that. There may have been. I suspect that there were, but that was not reported. I can't say. I suspect there probably were. Understand also that most people, this took place at noon. Most people were working. They weren't aware of it, and then they read about it in the paper. Okay, the way it worked, events had a morning edition and it had like an evening edition. And so they came home and then they read about it in the evening edition and they heard about it, and then the next day. So many of them might not have known what was going on until the next day. But we don't know, and it was not reported. And so the only newspaper that reported on the day-to-day aspects, that was the Daily Advance. So that's all we have. So I can't say for sure, but I suspect it might have been. But we do know that the second day, the numbers were significant enough that it was reported in the paper.
So our next question, said police did not overreact on day one of protests. What exactly did they do?
They never arrested anybody. W.T. Grant could have said, arrest these demonstrators. W.T. Grant did not do that. W.T. Grant did not do that. For the most part, Police Chief Owens was interested in public safety. He didn't want anybody to get hurt. And so he had officers in the business, and he had some detectives there to make certain that there weren't any fights, any people getting, because again, this was a major issue that outraged people. People were just, I mean, this was seen by many as, how dare you? How dare you challenge our customers? Who do you think you are? You know, your students. Who do you think you are trying to challenge the way things are down here? But he was mostly focused on protecting everybody. But again, if W.T. Grant had said, hey, these people are trespassing against my property, you need to arrest them, then Owens probably would have arrested them. But he wasn't going to arrest anybody unless he was told to. Now in 63, it was quite different. In 1963, restaurants said, we want these people arrested. These are trespassers. They're breaking the law in the state. And there is a statute in North Carolina law about trespassing. And they considered this to be trespassing. But W.T. Grant didn't want it. That they weren't going to arrest these people, at least in Elizabeth City. Now, I'm not going to say every town it was the same. I don't know how W.T. Grant responded in the other 179 locations. But the focus was on safety.
Okay. So do we have any more questions out there for Dr. Bowman? Like I said, if you have a question, you're more than welcome to type your question into the Q&A, and
Sure.
Dr. Bowman will answer that question for you.
Also, Lori, I'm happy to answer questions sent to my professional email address. Even though I'm actually not really on contract because it's summer vacation. I usually don't wear a suit and tie at home. But I do answer my email, and if you do have questions, I said I'm a state employee and I'm here to serve taxpayers in North Carolina. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay.
You're welcome to contact me at gcbowman@ecsu.edu.
Okay. And I do have a question that has popped up.
Yes.
Did MLK's actions have any direct influence to the events here?
In 1960, he was not a major national figure at that point. In 1963, absolutely, most definitely. 1963 was quite different. 1960, this seemed to be, I said, I'm not saying that Dr. King didn't support these activities, but in terms of the involvement, the inspiration, I don't see it as major as it was in 1963. 63, it was on a much greater level.
Okay.
But there were faculty members on campus who were closely connected with Dr. King. His sister-in-law worked on campus, Edith Bagley, and his personal secretary at one point was the spouse of Leonard Ballou, who was a music professor and later ECSU archivist of sorts. So there was definitely a Martin Luther King Jr. connection on campus. I'm not going to say, though, that Dr. King directly inspired the 1960. He may have, but I don't have the evidence, the primary source evidence to say that with any degree of certainty.
So, any questions? So I'm going to give them just a minute to go ahead and see if we have any more questions. But Dr. Bowman, I'm going to share a screen right fast like for our next History for Lunch coming up. So our next History for Lunch, can everyone see the screen? Will be Wednesday, August the 5th at 12 p.m. and we'll have Dr. Melissa N. Stuckey from ECSU, and her topic's going to be Rediscovering Elizabeth City's Early 20th Century African American Business District, which she is she will be working with her this fall in completing some research using primary resources on identifying African American businesses here in Elizabeth City. And we invite you to join on August the 5th. And I will be also establishing the Zoom information for that History for Lunch also. So I was just looking. So we have a comment, and we have Miss Johnson, and she remembers the sit-in when she was in high school. She said to some classmates, I thought it was great. Oh, I'm just going to read the comment.
Okay,
I
great.
remember the sit-in when I was in high school. I said to some classmates, I thought it was great that this was happening. The remark I got was to ask if she was a lover. Thank goodness it's better now. So
I've heard that before, is that there was definitely a generation gap. The young people were supportive of it. The older generation felt that this was too confrontational, and they were just raised completely differently, and there was definitely a generation gap in that regard. And there always is, but this seems to have been more so than usual. I'm glad she shared. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing to Mrs. Johnson. So if we don't have any more questions, again, I want to thank Dr. Bowman for joining us today on this talk. And I would like everyone that joined in on the lecture too. We will be, we have recorded today, and the talk will be available on the museum's YouTube account. So if you Google Museum of the Albemarle, we do have a YouTube account, and any talks that you might miss, we have all of them YouTube account that you can go back and catch later. Or if this is information that you would like to share with your family and friends, just ask them to go to our YouTube account, and all of our talks are up there. So again, thank you, Dr. Bowman. Thank you to all of our guest visitors today. We hope to be able to welcome everyone back to the museum in the near future, but as of right now, we're closed at least through July the 17th until Governor Cooper makes another announcement. But we're ready here at the museum to welcome everyone back as soon as we possibly can get you through the doors. We just hope everyone stays safe. Remember the 3 W's, and we'll be able to get you back in here rather than later. How about that? Again, Dr. Bowman, thank you, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.
Too. Thank you.